5 minutes is not very long. Oh, we're live already on YouTube. Hello, everyone.
No, it isn't.
Hi, everyone. So thank you one more time for being on this. So welcome to Demo Debate Stage 2. And can you please introduce yourselves?
Hi, I'm Noam. I'm going to be speaking first for the side of government.
G'day, I'm Rob. I'll be speaking deputy.
Hadar, leader of opposition.
And Lovro, deputy leader of opposition.
Okay, so let's begin. Now we call the Prime Minister. You have 7 minutes. Here.
Unmuting is important. Okay, so need my timer. Okay, starting in 3, 2, 1. Our problem as the people operating for democracy or against oppression or against the attempts to drag down functioning democracies into dysfunction and undemocratic situations is that we're using one specific set of tools. We keep using this tool set of credible facts and figures and realities and even-handedness and credibility, and those tools clearly don't appeal for the majority of the people, or at least for a very dramatic amount of people. Therefore, all we're suggesting is that in specific cases, we will also deploy a second set of tools, a set of emotional tools, a set of tools using fakes, a set of tools that is less mindful of credibility and truth. A 5-point mechanism and definition for how, when, and where we're using this. First of all, note that this isn't a blanket thing. We're not meant or have to support this in every single context. We will be very specific about the context we decide. We think they're both broad and fair and enable debate. So second point of mechanism, where? So we say 2 specific cases. One, the democracies which are having difficulties, Hungary, the USA, Israel, where the democratic regime is being challenged and as such. Secondly, places that are non-democratic, but sort of on the fence and could potentially sway, or like even not, right? Places like Gabon, places like Zimbabwe, places like even Russia, places like Belarus. These are the important places for that part of the debate. We think they're both legitimate. Secondly, the when. So we think, or third point of mechanism is the when. Either when the other side is also using this, also using fakes, also using disinformation, also using deep fakes, also using Twitter bots, etc., or when the other side just has a strong state media apparatus that's just spreading these same lies, except with the credibility of the state apparatus. Fourth point of mechanisms is what? What are we gonna do? Because a lot of teams in this round, I think, took the strategy of trying to do credible things, trying to do believable things. We're not doing that at all. We're going full fake media playbook, i.e. we are going to find things that could reasonably be true, but are kind of conspirative. We are just gonna make up that they're true, and we are going to distribute them. So for example, it seems exceedingly likely that Donald Trump was involved in the Jeffrey Epstein incidents of sexual assault, but there is no proof. We are going to make up that proof. We're going to provide a grainy interrogation room video of Ghislaine Maxwell saying that Trump exactly did that. We are going to make up that he's unable to go downstairs or drink because he has a certain dysfunction and disease, which makes him unfit to lead. We're going to make up psych notices about this person. We're going to talk a lot about the Prime Minister of Israel's relationship with his family and especially his wife, and maybe make up a diagnosis for her. I hope she's not hearing this. We're going to make up these things that could reasonably believable, but really they're conspiracy theories. We're going to use deep fakes and technology to do this, and we're going to have a lot of help from hackers and do it in a really good way. And lastly, the who. We're going to use anonymous and separated factors, i.e. the mainstream left is not going to necessarily retweet this majorly, just like maybe to cast doubt, but we're going to separate the 2 mechanisms of persuasion that we have a little bit as actors. So I'm going to talk about efficacy with just a whole bunch of internal points, and then Rob will talk about principles if opposition feel like disputing them. So firstly, different people perceive the world differently, i.e. yes, there are these high information voters that are really interested, that have developed critical thinking skills, have the sort of same epistemology that we like to think of and use, sort of like the debaters of the voters of the world, right? And they're not completely negligible. They're like 1/3 to 40% of the population, I think, in a lot of countries, to make up a ballpark figure. The thing is, with those people were mostly winning already. Like in those cases are usually so extreme IRL that those people wouldn't be swayed. And note that like having some marginal activists doing wrong things would also not be a tipping point for any of them, because guess what? Reality is the tipping point. The reality of living under a regime which they perceive as extremely oppressive is just significantly more important. But the second type is people with low information, people who are very swayed by emotion, people who are very swayed by the sort of initial intuition. Those are the people who we're going to be targeting. Now, why do conspiracy theories work? And this is like personal pet peeve of mine, because just the brain is hardwired to find pattern A, and B, the people tend to prefer their own logical incursions and their own logical conclusions to those of others. And so therefore, if they're able to sort of reach a conclusion, to figure out the puzzle, to solve the pieces, to assemble the pieces, and if it's really an interesting and sexy story, then you have the IKEA effect. Since it's something that I sort of believed on my own, and I believe, and I and only a bunch of people in the know-how know, then there's strong internal, like personal psychological pressure and social pressure to continue believing it and also advancing it to other people. Before I continue with the argument, yes, Hadar, please.
Why would you need fake news when the reality of regimes such as Trump's regime exceeds every dark humor you can come up with?
Because mostly the reality is complicated. The reality of what Trump is doing to democracy, to the Congress, to et cetera, is quite, to immigrants, is quite complicated. And the sort of people that either care about it or are highly informed enough are already voting for me. I say do this in addition to reach more people and to reach different people. Now, why would this specifically work? The reaction to it is very visceral. We're going to produce images that are visually powerful. Like imagine the Ghislaine Maxwell video. Imagine Trump sitting on an MRI machine. Imagine one, like, we're not going to always do it for the prime minister, but maybe a senior advisor saying something very racist, or saying something, you know what, even saying something like not conservative or not religious, or saying something very, very sexual in cases where that would disturb. So we're going to produce these really sexy, really interesting, really visceral images. People are going to dispute them. And now we get to the most fun part, which I saved for the last minute, which is the power of doubt. Because a lot of what people talk about in this debate is denials. But note that the denial is the best part. And this literally happened in Israel. Fake news invented that Benjamin Gantz was a sexual offender when he was a teenager. And the man got on TV and said, I was not a sexual offender as a teenager. And then all of us had this inane discussion. Is he a sexual offender? Isn't he a sexual offender? You know, you can go both ways. You can sort of, once people cast doubt, they inherently delegitimize the discussion. And as we, like, as liberal people sort of really frustratingly know, it doesn't matter that the truth is on your side because you don't have the sexier story. So once you cast doubt, you only significantly amplify the initial fake news, which means the other side is in a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation. If they don't respond, cool, they're clearly afraid, it's clearly the truth. But if they do respond, we win, right? Because now all of the country is talking about whether person X did that, whether Trump has sleep apnea. Now we're all talking about that. And so the dynamic of denial only amplifies and strengthens the messages we're pursuing. For those reasons, please propose. Thanks.
Okay, we thank the Prime Minister for their great speech, and now I call the leader of opposition. Here.
Cool. I'm going to start in 3, 2, 1, go. 2 main points. Firstly, we're going to prove why it is likely that actually we will be found out in most occasions, and why, at least even if it is found out in some occasions, it is enough to completely halt the struggle of democratic activists. Secondly, why even on the best case scenario of government that it is never found out, it is simply inherently anti-democratic and antithetical to their own purpose in this debate. Before that, 2 main points of extraneous rebuttal. Firstly, to the idea that we need something emotional in order to actually get people to cast doubt or whatever. We agree. You know what is emotional? Detaining immigrant children in cages is emotional. Hurting and oppressing populations in Chechnya because of their sexual orientation is emotional. We have no idea why emotionalism is unique in any way to fake news. When we talk about, in the first place, a struggle for democracy, when the opposing party or the non-democratic party is in any way committing atrocities against human rights, we think it is rather damn emotional, right? We have no idea why we need uniquely the things that are fake in order to cast doubt. Secondly, we completely don't accept the assumption from Prime Minister that people who already support us are going to support us anyway. At some point, you're going to look from Democrat to pig to Democrat, and from Democrat to pig again, and not spot the difference. We think that for many people who cherish democracy to a very large extent, when many people already participate in whataboutism, and Biden is not a real left-wing, etc., many people who see the democratic whatever activists in any country whatsoever that are not so pleased with the opposing party, but just don't like the authoritarian regime, need to believe that they have a viable alternative. At the point at which they don't believe it, we cannot just treat them as a captive audience that is going to continue voting for us. Let's get to the constructive points. Firstly, why is it extremely likely that people will find this out despite all of the 5 points of mechanism that we get from Prime Minister? Firstly, we think that inherently there are going to be inconsistencies because, you know, lies tend to be inconsistent. At the point at which you tell a fake story about reality, you tell something about a corruption incident, that there are going to be witnesses that are going to say it didn't happen because it was literally false, you are going to have troubles to sell this sort of narrative. Secondly, the fact that it is extremely hard to get evidence to defend this, and this is important because, note, the party that is already in control, the authoritarian regime, is going to call you out and obviously call fake news, at which point you are going to be called to the testimony and try to give your evidence, and you're not going to have any evidence because you know it's false. It's not the real situation. Thirdly, note how it is enough to have just one snitch in every such operation in order to completely discredit the entirety of the operation. It is enough to have one person, one photographer, one journalist, one person involved to tell this did not happen, to completely debunk your credibility. Fourthly, the fact that just inherently the government has so much more resources in order to debunk this and actually find the evidence that you're hiding than you have evidence in the first place to hide it and use hackers, because you are not the oppressive government that has so much control of the media narrative and of the budgets. And the government is probably already quite of an expert themselves in knowing how fake news works, because to be fair, who is a better expert on fake news than the GOP? They probably know what they are looking for. They probably know how this is supposed to look like. They will find out the inconsistencies to call you on. This is important because, note, it is not our burden in this debate to prove even that the likely scenario is you're going to be found out. It is enough for us to prove that in some occasions you will be found out so that no one will trust you on all of the rest. Governments need to defend the case that every single case in which we are going to lie, people are going to buy it. Otherwise, you know, fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me. People are just not going to believe us any further. Which brings me directly to the impacts of why it is so terrible for us to be found out on that. Few things on that, and I'm going to be very clear also on the marginal difference here, right? We think that firstly, when these regimes often try to prosecute the activists themselves, they need to have a claim, because as Noam characterized this debate, it doesn't happen completely in North Korea or whatever, but rather in sub-authoritarian regimes such as Hungary. You still have public backlash, you still have international scrutiny to an extent. You need to have some sort of valid proof in order to incarcerate someone, which is exactly why in Russia, when they tried to incarcerate the Pussy Riot, they got so many backlash from the international arena, right? At the point at which the international arena cannot say anything because they are just correct, you are just lying, this is the point at which you're going to have it so much easier to incarcerate people. Secondly, the ability to now make people believe less in the sort of media that you are provoking, right? Because at the point at which this casting of doubts that Noam describes now happens on your side as well, because note, we already cast doubt. We fully support showing that the authoritarian regimes lie themselves or do atrocities, etc. But now we are losing our high moral ground. Now people are more likely to suspect and not believe us when we actually complain on valid actual atrocities happening outside. And thirdly, we think just in terms of having infights in the movement, it is going to make so much harm, because note how important it is. The main reason why Hungary has Orban in the ruling party for like a decade or so is because the opposition is fractured. At the point at which the opposition is not united because opposition parties do not trust one another, you know that they can be lying themselves. This is the point at which you have less power to actually replace an oppressive regime. Before I move on, I'd love to have a POI.
The lack of credibility of QAnon or Alex Jones has done nothing to damage the credibility of, for example, the Wall Street Journal. The entities are separate and remain so.
Cool, thank you. We think two things are different here. Firstly, we think that activists are actually actively identified with the movement more so than just, Alex Jones or whatever. But we think that secondly, we do acknowledge that there is a power asymmetry here, right? The party that is already in the regime, in control, has more sway of the public opinion and makes it easier for them to make people continue believing them and say, these are some rotten apples, this is not the entirety of the movement. Whereas we don't have this leverage since we are on the losing side currently. But also let's talk about principle, because we think that insofar as government in this debate cares about the principle of democracy, a pre-existing requirement for democracy is an informed voter. At the point at which people just vote based on lies, they vote based on atrocities that did not in fact actually happen, this is the point at which you do not get a valid democracy. It is similar to arguing that the democratic activists should fraud elections in order to get elected just because, utilitarianly speaking, it might be beneficial for them, but obviously it is anti-democratic, right? We need the democratic activists to win based on true reasons and on the public informed choice on them, not based on, lying to the public and getting undemocratically into the regime. Beg you to oppose.
We thank the leader of opposition for their fine speech, and now I call the Deputy Prime Minister. Here.
Just be 1 second, gotta sort out the notes. All right. Only opposition wants us to win these elections in the right way, in a principally justified and correct way, with no fake news and engaging properly. The problem is that the playing field is not fair. The problem is that the other side does not, excuse me, does not share those values and does not operate in the same way. We are in a state of war against these groups that are crushing our rights as pro-democratic groups to exercise our freedom of speech. They are controlling the absence of that free press. The problem is that the media and the fake news is already corrupted. The fake news is out there. Us adding more in there doesn't necessarily make things a whole lot worse in terms of the quantity or nature of fake news being out there, but it does stand the chance to push back against that tide and maybe lead to some better outcomes at the end. And that, I think, is the most important part that we need to focus on. And that's why I think opening government is taking this so far. So the first question I want to look at is this one around principle justification, as Noam suggested in his speech that I would do. So what we hear from Hadar is this idea at the end of their speech around that, well, we have a pre-existing requirements act in ways what's what I'm looking for? Appropriate, are good, are ways that are moral and not engaging the same sort of hypocritical behavior of engaging that fake news. I think the first thing to note here is we don't extend necessarily as far to like voter fraud and to like rigging election boxes. If we get away with it, maybe, but let's focus on the debate specifically around the absence of fake news. I think what's important here to consider is that we are justified in taking this as a step of self-defense. We are using proportionally the same tactics that are being used against us now against them. And I think that is crucial in this debate because the propaganda is already fake news. The Alex Joneses, the memes, etc., are already sitting out there the same messages that are harmful to us. It is within our rights to respond in a way that is akin to that and a way that starts to challenge that. And we think that is particularly important. And I think that becomes even more important given all the rhetoric that Hadar gives around how powerful the state apparatus is and how powerful the groups are that we are opposing. Because of that very power asymmetry, we have to use every tool at our disposal to fight back. And I think that is why it is justified, therefore, for us to use this as a principle of self-defense. The second thing I want to do then under this point then is then weigh this up against maybe some practical harms and why they don't matter as much. Because the first big practical harm we hear is that we'll actually lose support as a consequence of this from our own base. I think the problem with this argument is it doesn't actually break down the types of people that we are trying to get in our supporter base. Because there are obviously people who will never support us, and there are a group of people who will likely be quite like latched onto our pro-democratic values. And the reason we're not likely to lose them, or at worst case for us, not lose anywhere near a substantial number of them, is because they recognize that the ultimate goal we are fighting for is the most important thing here. And in this case, the ends justify the means, and it is a necessity for us to achieve that. Sitting on the fence on your morals does nothing when you are shot off that fence. We would prefer you to actually take a stand and maybe compromise some aspects of that for the greater good, and we think they're likely to understand why that is likely to actually do this. But secondly, as we told you in the model and setup, we're likely to try and disassociate this fake news in some ways from those leaders of the movement, so they can like have some degree of plausible deniability and can in some way separate the two things. But thirdly, I think importantly here, there is no alternative. They have not provided a way in which real news can break through. They have not provided a way in which facts and logic can actually destroy the opposition. And I think that is crucial in terms of why it is okay for us to use that, even if in worst case, we lose some people. There are a couple of other practical harms, though, they point to. The first one is it now becomes easier to lock us up. The first thing, and it's a bit facetious, but we'll be anonymous, we'll use VPNs. Like, there's lots of people on the internet that get away with a lot of stuff that is quite bad. I think we can do that as well. And particularly, we're also pro-democratic. We're a pretty sympathetic group to the world, so I think a lot of people are likely to help us and provide us that technological cover to do that. But I think the second thing I'd say around the potential to lock us up is this is grossly context dependent. Because in the USA, it is still some degree of a rule of law. They can't just lock random people up for nothing. But in the more worst case scenarios, the Russians, etc., they already don't need a justification. But importantly and crucially here, and I think this is terminal for their case, to quote Arth, I think that the justification they would need to lock you up in those more authoritarian regimes is just you presenting true news that is in contradiction to the state. So criticizing the government, criticizing the courts in Singapore, for example, would be considered illegal, even if you're talking about the true facts that are occurring. So there's no real change on that side. I think the second thing is, in terms of the international community then not being able to support us as a consequence, I still think, as they point out, there is plenty of evidence the international community can point to in order to support the pro-democratic groups, and that is still far more preferable to that of the oppressive regime. Before I go on, I will take the POI.
We are happy under our side to support calling out the other side for fake news, which we do. And by the way, Biden is leading on the current election poll, so we do have an alternative. We are losing the high moral ground to do so once we are also liars ourselves.
Maybe we wouldn't use it in the case of Biden right now then, because he is likely to win. But if those polls flipped around, we probably would use it in that case then. But again, that doesn't engage with scenarios like in Russia or in Belarus or Bolivia or Brazil or other countries where it might be a different scenario to that, and we're happy to support it in those cases there. The next claim I want to look at is this one about will we be found out? The first response I want to give here is that deepfakes are actually pretty good. The technology is advancing massively. Now, capacity to make convincing, compelling deepfakes are really good. But additionally, we can build in like fakeness to it to make it look like it's just fake. It's just like dodgy enough to be real, in the way we have grainy footage or like that weird VHS thing that comes up when you plug a VHS in for the first time. The second thing they say about whether we found out is that we'll be called out by the government as having fake news. Entirely not mutually exclusive, right? It doesn't matter whether we say the truth or not. We're going to be called out for that. We may as well just throw as much out as we can at the same time. And again, the next times we'll be called to testify. I think that's very unlikely for all the reasons we gave you as to why you're likely to be anonymous in this process and not actually caught. And I think the last thing here I want to say is on this question of like your validity will now be debunked. But even if in our worst case, the validity is debunked, that doesn't respond to Noam's point about doubt that gives you about Gantz and the way in which it sticks in people's mind. And I'll add a couple more here. Look at Zodiac Killer and Ted Cruz. It just won't go away. To use a very Australian example, everyone believes that our Prime Minister shit his pants in Macca's after his team lost the NRL Grand Final, even though it's probably not true. But there's a sign outside that Macca's saying this is where it happened. The capacity of doubt is a powerful one. And given all that then, why is this likely to be effective in achieving our aims here? The first is we had to be comparative to a world in which we could not use real news because it wasn't working. I think that responds to Hadar's POI to Noam. But additionally, we need to target different audiences here. We need to break down people who want something spicy, who like conspiracy theories, who want to be able to buy into a different vision of the world. And that's the unique power that fake news gives us. And fake news fake news as the method was explicitly and uniquely important here, because fake news allowed us to like create conversations that Trump never had. It allowed us to add evidence where evidence didn't exist to support truths that we wanted to be true. And that was why we couldn't just rely on real news. We had to use fake news because of the unique and different power it had. And that's what convinced people. At the end of the debate, we support fake news, I guess. And thank you very much.
Okay, we thank the deputy panelists for their great speech, and now we call upon the deputy leader of opposition here.
Okay, just to check that someone can hear me.
Yes.
Awesome. So I will start soon. Okay, so I think that the deeps and the news they use will be fake, but the prison will be very, very real in which these activists are going to end up. And I think the reason why opening governments spend so much time mechanizing believes motion is because they want to have this debate on ideal grounds for them. And I think you shouldn't do this in debates, and this is a bad example for demo. But I think that here are the reasons why this is not going to be ideal as they want it to be. Because why won't use this moderately? At the point where you start using this, you need to have some sort of justification why you started, and you need to have some progress. If that justification doesn't happen for whatever reason, the government gets some ground, achieves some successful economic policy, you're always going to double down on actually trying to achieve something with this, because otherwise you are failing. Which means that you get in this loop of needing success and willing to do everything to be successful once you introduce this very different measure to what you've been doing for the whole time as the opposition. You will also be very shitty in status quo because I don't think you have the expertise necessary to do this, or at least you don't have the expertise necessary to do this compared to the government, which you all agree uses this on a daily basis. So I think that this will be of very low quality and easily to figure out all this. But even if you manage to do this, even if you believe their mechanism, I think you won't get the media attention from government. That's pretty obvious, right? Why would they show something which is not in their interest? But social media is not comparative in this case because it won't get shared to people who support the government already, and people who support you, I don't know why they need initial fake reasons to support you if they're already on your side of the house. So the only way in which this could be comparative is the independent media. I think they will want to probably remain independent. And at the point where they show your fake news, or sometimes it's discovered that it's your fake news, or they just have a sense that this is not true, they're not going to share you. And that means that you're probably also going to get less airtime on them, because when you start producing fake news, then they are not independent anymore if they show you as opposition leader, because you're also using something which they have probably fought for ages against, right? So they've been calling out the government because they've been using fake news and creating fake narratives and all of this, which means that you lose much of your media support in this situation. But how exactly does the government retaliate, and why it's different to usual oppression and but they always retaliate and all this? It's easier to prosecute because you're actually committing something which is criminal. And they say, but in these sort of societies, they can lock you down for truth. But that means that they can pin you down for this. So every time there is something that attacks the president or the leader of the government or someone from the authoritarian regime, they're going to pin it down to you as the opposition leader. And they're going to say, look at what they did. They produced this. They're also going to fabricate their own fake news about them and then pin it to you. And this is going to be so ridiculous that people are going to see not trust it at all, but they're still going to pin it to you if the situation is that you are going to get punished for the truth. We think that the situation is not so dire or black and white. We think you can still speak out in some instances. There are some media where you can show up. There are some instances of democratic, opposition in courts and all of this, but it's not, of course, a situation where you can't do anything. I think you also get less consciousness in government, right? Because people who are more hardcore, who would kill all opposition and use more brutal methods, now get more incited and get more support because they've been like, we've been telling you, these are the devils, they're financed by the international enemies, and they are helping them to create fake news against our patriotic country and all of this. And that means that the moderate people in the administration to get comparatively less voice. Sure, they can say, they never exist, but they exist. You have a wide area of people who work for the administration for various reasons, and you shut down the ones who are more opposition, right? On this whole idea that conspiracy theories work, reality is complicated, that you cast doubt, this is sexy. I think the comparative right now is, that government bots exist who do things for a sandwich. There is one independent media you can trust probably in your country. The government is using fakes in the status quo. So actually, the situation right now is not complex. It's pretty simple. We are on the right side of the battle, they are on the wrong side of the battle, look at what they are doing to us and all of this. I think when you actually, what's the counter comparative? When you start using fake news, this is when you create a situation that's extremely muddied and complicated because the truth stops being the truth. Because you don't know who to trust, the truth itself does not exist as a concept anymore. And I think this decreases your willingness to fight for change because it loses the idea of we are good and they are bad and all this, but it instills in people a sense of doubt for everything. And this is crucial when it comes to actual things that can, facilitate democratic change, when it comes to protests, when it comes to boycotts and all of this, because every time you do something, you're going to have this idea of, but what is actually true in this case, because everyone is lying, everyone is using fake news. So for example, when your organization is telling you that there are some government insurgents in there, or there are not government insurgents in there, you're not going to trust it as you were before they started using fakes or before they started lying. And in this case, for example, you're going to question your own, how to say, protests and things that happen, because the perception is that everything is relative and nothing is objective. I'll take you. Okay, so I think that also on this idea that the playing field is not level, I think that the only way to win over power in a semi-democratic regime is to unify the opposition, because otherwise it would not be a semi-democratic regime. And I think this is impossible with fakes, because everyone draws their side and people are opposed to the extent of this, to who it should target, what should be targeted, maybe values, maybe conservatism, maybe some of the issues like regards to, like, I don't know, social issues and all of this. And this is definitely going to create rifts alongside your movement. Can I get POI now?
According to the logic opposition presents, fake news by the right in the West has been completely counter-beneficial, and we shouldn't worry about it at all. If that's what you believe, I guess vote opening opposition, but otherwise vote for us.
You guys keep talking about the United States, and like all of your examples mostly are about that guy who created InfoWars and all of these things, but these are not applicable to Belarus, Serbia, or the other countries that we are talking about, where you actually have someone who is fighting pro-democracy and you have someone who is fighting against democracy. Because I don't know if you guys want to claim that in the United States, Republicans are fighting against democracy. I think that's a questionable in this debate, and your framing is kind of like a little bit liberal there. Okay, so I think that what also harms this argument they have, that this is not a playing field and that we should like use all instances that we can, is when you win power over, and you essentially will, or there's no impact in this, you will fuck each other with fake news when it comes to ideological and economical differences, because you're going to have multiple leaders that are going to be the unified opposition, and they're going to then start using fake news on their own, because the differences are going to be the same. You're going to say, oh, now we got rid of the dictator or the democratic regime, but now this guy wants to nationalize these things, and I think I'm very neoliberal, and this is how we should do it. I think this, in the end, is a reason why you are going to get a less stable government if you manage to change the regime or question it, and that's why I think you should vote for all.
Okay, thank you everyone for this debate.